All right, let's jump right in. Today, we're not just passively looking at a picture. We are going to dissect a full-on visual thriller. We're going to pull apart the actual mechanics of suspense, literally frame by frame and brush stroke by brush stroke. Think about your favorite psychological horror film for a second. How does the director make your heart race before anything even happens on screen? They use lighting, right? Framing, unseen threats? Well, in this explainer, we are going to see how a single static image can achieve that exact same level of cinematic dread. So get comfortable, because we're about to entirely deconstruct the architecture of fear. So the big question we've got to start with is simply this. How do you paint raw panic? I mean, really ask yourself, how does an artist capture not just a fleeting moment, but this overwhelming, suffocating feeling of tension without any moving parts? No sound design, no jump scares. How do you make the viewer physically uncomfortable using nothing but pigment and composition? Well, let's dive into it and find out. Boom, you are dropped right into it. Look at the sheer emotional impact radiating off her face. The very first thing that pulls you in are those wide, glistening eyes. They're locked onto something we can't quite see, but man, we instantly feel her terror. Notice her parted lips, that slight glisten of sweat or maybe tears on her flushed cheeks. There's no slow buildup here, you know? We're thrown directly into the climax of a terrifying narrative. The artist is basically forcing an immediate, visceral reaction out of us before we've even had a chance to process the rest of the room. Now, to understand exactly why this image feels so heavy and inescapable, we need to take a quick look at the heavy oil aesthetic itself. Which brings us to a super crucial artistic term, impasto. So this is a technique where paint is laid incredibly thickly onto a surface. So thick, in fact, that the brush or painting knife strokes remain entirely visible. It creates literal, physical depth on the canvas. Fun factor. While artists like Van Gogh use this to create vibrant, swirling energy, in this piece, it's used for the exact opposite. Because in this context, the tactile, heavy nature of the paint fundamentally amplifies the claustrophobia. The air in this room doesn't feel thin, it feels thick, muddy, and genuinely hard to breathe. The medium itself becomes a tool for suspense. And you can actually see that impasto technique doing the heavy lifting right here. Look really closely at those thick, suffocating brushstrokes around the woman's face, her neck, and her dress. It's almost as if the environment is carved out of something solid and jagged. This visual weight literally traps the subject within the frame. The harsh lines of the paint on her skin aren't just showing light and shadow. They are depicting a very tactile dread. Honestly, she looks like she's physically bound by the very texture of the world she's painted into. All right, with that suffocating vibe established, let's break down the composition. The artist masterfully constructs the psychological trap using 3 distinct points of tension. I like to call this the narrative triangle. We've got point A, the victim's expression, point B, the unseen aggressor's grip, and point C, the foreboding silhouette. Let's methodically break down how these 3 points lock together to ensnare the viewer's eye. Starting with point A, let's focus entirely on the woman's face. Notice how her cheeks are just slightly hollowed, her mouth is agape in this silent gasp, and her gaze is totally forced upward. That upward angle? Absolutely critical. It communicates an inescapable, forced submission. She's looking up at a threat that is towering over her, establishing an immediate power dynamic. We don't even need to see the rest of her body to know she is cornered. The geometry of her face tells the whole story of her vulnerability. And that brings us brilliantly to point B. Shift your focus up to the top right of the frame, that heavy, disembodied hand gripping her hair. This is our unseen aggressor. Just the sheer size and the tension in the tendons of that hand are terrifying. It violently forces her perspective, and by extension, it forces ours. By keeping the actual body of this attacker out of frame, the artist establishes a dominant threat just outside our view. It makes the threat feel limitless, mainly because our own imagination is left to fill in the terrifying blanks of who or what is standing right over her. Finally, point C completes our triangle. Direct your eyes over to the blurred background on the left. See that looming male silhouette behind the frosted glass of the door? This introduces a secondary, impending intrusion. Like, it's bad enough that she's already captured by the hand above her, but now we've got this dark, faceless figure waiting just on the other side of a fragile barrier. The frosted glass is such a brilliant touch. It obscures the exact details but totally highlights the proximity. You can almost hear the muffled sound of knocking, right? The tension is coming from inside the room and outside the room simultaneously. Now, check out the subtle, honestly chilling shifts between these two variations side by side. On the left, the silhouette in the glass has his hand raised just slightly differently than the figure on the right. The angle of the woman's face, the precise widening of her eyes, these minute adjustments completely shift the intensity of her fear. It just goes to show you how delicate suspense really is. Just moving a shadowy hand an inch to the left or tightening that grip on her hair by a fraction can escalate the dread exponentially. Okay, we are now entering what I like to call the climax of framing. We're going to cycle through these next few iterations pretty rapidly to simulate that frantic, heart-beating climax of a thriller. Keep an eye on how these subtle changes dial up the panic. Ready? Heartbeat 1. Look at the tightened grip of that hand. The brushstrokes actually seem to converge faster around her head. There's this immediate spike in visual urgency. And the silhouette in the background? It feels slightly sharper now, pressing right into our awareness. Heartbeat 2. Notice the subtle shift of the silhouette's hand. It looks like it is pressing completely flat against that frosted glass now. The intrusion is imminent. The woman's eyes are wider. The contrast between the dark shadows and her flush skin is way starker. The walls are literally closing in. Heartbeat 3. And we stop. Let's just let this image sit for a second. This is the peak. We're slowing the pace way down here to emphasize the breathless, completely inescapable nature of this frozen moment. The triangle is locked. The grip is firm, the victim is paralyzed, and the shadow is right at the door. There is absolutely nowhere for the tension to resolve. We are left suspended in pure, unadulterated dread. Which brings us to our final and maybe most unsettling thought of this explainer. By looking at this scene, by analyzing the angle, the gaze, and the composition, whose perspective are you really forced to share? I mean, you aren't the woman, you aren't the shadow at the door. Because of the angle looking down at her and her eyes looking directly up, past that gripping hand, the composition makes you an active participant. It leaves you to ponder your own role here. Are you the unseen watcher? Are you complicit in the suspense? That's the true genius power of framing fear. It doesn't just show you a terrifying scene, it actively traps you inside it. What a masterpiece. Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're stepping right into the shadows of visual storytelling. You know that feeling when you look at a piece of art and your pulse just literally quickens? Some images, they don't just ask to be looked at, they absolutely demand to be felt. They grab hold of our innate sense of danger and just refuse to let go. And the crazy thing is, modern movie directors and photographers use these exact same techniques to hijack our nervous systems today. So in this explainer, we're going to deconstruct a deeply evocative series of images to understand exactly how artists construct this kind of visceral cinematic tension. We're going to break down the anatomy of fear, frame by frame, and uncover how paint, composition, and ambiguity all work together to create a true psychological thriller. All right, let's just dive right in. Boom. Right away, we're thrust into this moment of pure, unadulterated terror. Your eyes instantly drawn to the woman's face. I mean, look at her wide, glistening eyes locked onto something just outside of our view. Her skin is flushed, which really conveys this frantic, high-stakes emotion. But what really grounds the horror of this scene is that massive, dominating hand gripping her hair from above. It's such a jarring intrusion into the frame, isn't it? We don't even see the body attached to that hand, and honestly, that makes the violation of her space feel so much more unpredictable and terrifying. It's like we've been dropped right into the climax of a nightmare, and the artist is forcing us to bear witness. So, moving on to Section 1, the weight of the paint. Physical claustrophobia. Now, this tension we're feeling, it isn't just about the story happening in the scene, it's about how the image is physically constructed. Before we look closer, we really need to understand this absolutely crucial technique at play here called impasto. Basically, impasto is a painting technique where oil paint is laid onto a surface incredibly thickly. We're talking so thick that the brush or palette knife strokes are clearly visible, literally rising off the canvas. To put that into perspective, paint applied this heavily can actually take months or even years to fully dry. It transforms what should be a flat image into a three-dimensional, sculpted surface. Keep this in the back of your mind, because it is the secret engine driving all the anxiety in these images. Just look at the viscous, sculpted application of the oil paint here, especially across her brow, her cheeks, and on that gripping hand. The paint isn't smoothed out at all. It's frantic, it's chaotic, and heavily textured.
This tactile roughness directly mirrors the heavy tension of the scene. The dread feels physically tangible, right? It's as if the suffocating atmosphere of the room has materialized into the thick grooves of the paint itself. It makes you feel like the environment is literally closing in on her, which adds this profound sense of physical weight to her psychological distress.
All right, Section 2, Framing the Threat, Altering Perception. Okay, so the medium sets the mood, but the framing, that's what actually tells the story. Let's shift gears from the physical paint to the composition itself. Comparing these two subtle variations side by side is just fascinating. On the left, you can see the lighting is a bit harsher, and her expression leans really heavily into pure paralyzed shock. But look at the version on the right. There are these very, very slight differences in the rendering of her eyes and the way the light catches her face. The angle just feels a fraction more vulnerable. And suddenly the emotional resonance shifts from just pure shock to a kind of desperate pleading. The artist is showing us how a millimeter of change in the arch of an eyebrow, or just a tiny glint of light, can entirely rewrite the victim's internal monologue. And as we analyze her face, we're naturally drawn to follow her gaze. She's staring upward, completely horrified. So we have to ask ourselves, what exactly is she looking at? And more importantly, who is casting that shadow looming behind her?
That brings us to Section 3, The Mirror's Dark Secret, a Complex Thriller.
So that question pivots our attention right away from the foreground and into the darker, recessed space of the room. This is crucial. It's how the artist layers visual clues to build this totally unbearable suspense. First up, we have that disembodied, dominant hand gripping her hair. That's our immediate physical threat. Second, we have her upward, desperate gaze at an unseen figure, the psychological threat standing right in front of her. But the final clue, this is the real twist. It's the ominous, obscured male silhouette in the background mirror. This is just a masterclass in staging. We aren't just dealing with a simple victim and attacker dynamic anymore. The composition expands the whole space and introduces a secondary presence.
Let's really zero in on that reflection. Notice the silhouette in the mirror. It's a man with his hand raised. Maybe he's leaning against the glass. Maybe he's gesturing. Is he a co-conspirator? Just a witness? Or is he the true mastermind of this entire terrifying scenario? By placing this figure in the reflection, the artist completely traps the subject between two presences, the physical hand above her and the silent watcher behind her. It creates this suffocating triangle of tension that leaves us, the viewer, feeling just as cornered as the woman on the floor.
Which leads us to our final section, Section 4, An Unfinished Story. What isn't there?
We've broken down the texture, the framing, those hidden clues in the background. But to truly understand why this artwork stays with you long after you've looked away, we actually have to talk about what isn't there. And this brings us to the artwork's ultimate superpower, ambiguity. Across all the variations we've studied today, the exact context remains entirely hidden. Who is she? Who are the men? How did she end up on this floor? The artist deliberately refuses to answer these questions for us. And honestly, that is exactly why it works so brilliantly. Ambiguity breeds suspense. By leaving the narrative completely unresolved, the artwork forces our own imaginations to step in and fill the terrifying blanks of this domestic thriller. 'Cause let's be real, the scariest monster is always the one you create in your own head. Which leaves us right here, with this final haunting image. As you look at the raw emotion captured in those thick strokes of paint, and as you follow her eyes to that unseen threat just outside the frame, you are left holding all the tension. The artist has guided us right up to the precipice of a terrible event, but then drops the curtain right before the climax. So I'll leave you with the most provocative question of all. What happens next? Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. I really hope you walk away today with a sharper eye for how tension is built stroke by stroke.
Welcome to this explainer. I'm going to ask you to lower the lights for this one because today we are stepping into something a little darker. We're looking at the very architecture of suspense. You know, we've all seen images that make our pulse jump, the kind that make us instinctively want to look away, but somehow keep our eyes totally glued to the screen. Well, today we are going to unpack exactly how an artist achieves that cinematic, high-tension atmosphere. We're going to deconstruct the anatomy of visual panic.
It's a pretty fascinating question for us to start with. What creates true visual panic? Is it just what we see, or is it what we're forced to imagine? In digital art and painting, fear isn't just about showing something scary, right? It's a meticulously constructed trap. It involves lighting, texture, framing, and psychology, all working together to put you in a state of absolute high alert. It's about building a structural deconstruction of fear right before our very eyes.
Just take a second to feel the immediate visceral impact of dread here. There is this unfiltered, heavy psychological weight to this moment. It feels incredibly illicit, almost like a piece of grainy VHS found footage that we were never actually meant to stumble upon. The tension in the dimly lit bedroom is literally suffocating. Before we even start to analyze why we feel this way, the artist has already completely succeeded in making us feel deeply, uncomfortably present in this space.
Section 1. The Anatomy of Terror. Deconstructing Fear. Okay, let's dive into this. We're going to break down our emotional response into hard visual evidence. Because we aren't just going to feel the fear, we're going to look at the specific anatomical parts of this terror to understand how this masterclass in suspense is built from the ground up. The suspense here relies on compounding elements, each layer on top of the other to create maximum claustrophobia. First, look at that downward oppressive perspective. We are looking down at the subject, immediately establishing a strict hierarchy of power. Second, we have a physical intrusion from out of frame. That heavy dominant hand pressing down implies a massive presence just outside our field of vision. Third, notice the blocked exit in the background, signaling that escape? Yeah, it's not an option. And finally, the fourth element, direct, desperate eye contact. She isn't looking at her unseen aggressor. She is looking directly at us, right into the lens, pulling us straight into the terror. Let's compare these subtle variations side by side. Watch closely how the slight shifts in her eyeline and the density of the shadows on her face and neck radically change the tone. In one version, the shadows are way harsher, deepening the hollows of her cheeks and making the threat feel much sharper. In the other, just a slight tilt of her head completely alters the psychological weight. It's wild how just a fractional change in the moody lighting or a millimeter shift in a gaze can turn a look of pure shock into one of absolutely desperate realization. Section 2. Framing the Victim. The Structural Pillars. Which brings us beautifully to our next structural pillar. The way an artist places the lens dictates our entire relationship with the subject. Here, the framing does some serious heavy lifting to trap us right alongside her. Observe the hyper-focused vulnerability. The artist is using what really feels like a handheld 90s camcorder-style perspective. It has that raw, gritty, almost distorted intimacy. Focus on the hyper-detailed rendering of her flushed face, the way her wide eyes are literally glistening with moisture. Her mouth is open, breathless, capturing this intense struggle. By validating our visceral reaction with this insane level of microdetail, the artist makes her distress totally undeniable. And this brilliantly illustrates the sheer complexity of human expression under duress. When you compare these two variations, you see an incredibly nuanced, conflicted emotional state. The expression isn't just one-note terror, it's this complicated mix of forced embarrassment and almost a sort of illicit submission to the dominant presence gripping her. She is entirely compromised. The subtle variations in the tension of her brow and the parting of her lips across these images really hit the nail on the head regarding just how fraught this moment is.
All of this leads us to a highly uncomfortable realization about this artwork. The viewer becomes the intruder. Because of this very specific downward camcorder angle, we are forced into the perspective of the aggressor. We are the ones looking down. We're sharing the vantage point of that unseen dominant presence. We aren't just passive observers here. The composition forces us into the deeply uncomfortable position of the voyeur, making us completely complicit in the intrusion.
Section 3. The Impasto Technique. Physical Dread. You know, it's one thing to create dread through framing and narrative, but it's another thing entirely to physically bake that dread right into the artwork itself. To understand how the artist gets this heavy, suffocating atmosphere, we have to talk about the stylistic execution. The secret weapon here is a technique called impasto. For those who might not know the term, impasto is basically the technique of laying on paint or pigment so thickly that it actually stands out from the surface. It creates visible ridges, bumps, physical texture. The artwork stops being just a flat image and becomes this three-dimensional, tactile object. It's such a brilliant way to give psychological weight a literal physical form.
So the crucial point is how this technique is actually applied here. Draw your attention to the intrusive hand pressing down on her head. You can practically feel the thick, dark ridges of the oil texture. The paint itself looks heavy, chaotic, aggressive. By using impasto, the artist makes the danger feel tactile and intensely present. It isn't a smooth, polished, pretty thread. It's rough, immediate, and physically pressing down on the canvas exactly the way the hand presses down on the subject.
Section 4. The Looming Threat. Looking beyond the foreground.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is that the hand and the hyper-detailed foreground are really only half the story. To fully appreciate the tension, we have to pull our focus away from the immediate victim and look into that blurred, obscured background to address a secondary, looming threat. What's truly terrifying is the bedroom door. While all this chaotic, visceral emotion is playing out on the floor, there is a male silhouette visible through the frosted glass panel of the shut door. He appears to be knocking or at the very least observing. This adds a whole new layer of illicit domestic tension. Someone is right outside. The trap isn't just inside the room, it's actively closing in from the hallway too.
This creates an absolutely masterful contrast, dividing the image into two distinct psychological zones. Up front, in the foreground, you have hyper-detailed vulnerability, explicit emotion, and this intense, suffocating focus. But then, in the background, you have faceless anonymity, completely obscured intentions, and an ambient, looming threat. The foreground is immediate, in-your-face danger. The background is inescapable consequence. By layering these two contrasting elements together, the suspense is essentially doubled.
Notice how this background threat shifts between these two versions. Over on the left, the silhouette's hand is raised slightly differently than on the right. His posture shifts just a fraction in that shadowy lighting, and these subtle changes do something incredible. They turn an anonymous, static figure into an active, unpredictable psychological threat. You have no idea when that door is going to open, but the heavy texture and that frosted glass make it abundantly clear that when it does, the situation is only going to escalate. When we pull back and look at the macro view, the whole shebang, we can see the synthesized masterpiece of suspense the artist has built. Every single choice serves the tension. The heavy, tactile impasto texture makes the danger feel totally real. The claustrophobic, downward framing traps us in the room. And those dual threats, the hand from above and the watcher behind the glass, they ensure there is absolutely no escape. Not for the subject, and for sure not for our eyes.
Which leaves us with a final, lingering thought to wrap up on. Given the incredible tension, the direct eye contact, and the voyeuristic perspective we've been forced into by the artist, are you trapped in this room with her, sharing in her dread? Or are you the one trapping her? It's a brilliant, highly unsettling piece of visual architecture that forces us to completely reevaluate our own role as the viewer. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and I'll catch you on the next one.